They thought they could crush me with a $150,000 fine, but they never expected the truth I uncovered. Because in the end, the land they claimed to control was mine all along. It began like any ordinary day, one of those calm mornings when the sun rises softly and you expect nothing unusual. I went about my routine, checked the mailbox, and flipped through the usual stack of envelopes, bills, and advertisements. But one envelope stood out immediately. It had the HOA logo on it, bold and official looking, with the kind of formality that instantly makes you nervous. At first, I assumed it was just another reminder about community guidelines or perhaps a notice about upcoming maintenance. However, as I opened the envelope and read the contents, my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a casual letter. It was a fine, not for a few $100s, not even for a few thousand, but an outrageous demand of $150,000. For a long moment, I couldn't believe what I was reading. My eyes scanned the paper over and over, hoping I had misread the number or misunderstood the intention. But no, right there in bold black ink, the HOA had issued a fine against me, claiming that I had violated several so-called community rules on my property. They listed items I had never even heard of, things that didn't make sense, and some accusations that had no connection to reality. According to them, my land was in violation of standards, and every supposed violation had been stacked up into this monstrous total. The number $150,000 felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. Who could imagine being fined such a massive amount for living on their own property? I felt my hands tremble as I held the paper, and a wave of disbelief washed over me. How could they even think this was acceptable? I tried to steady myself and remind my heart to slow down, but the letter kept pulling me back into shock. It wasn't just about money. It was about the sheer arrogance behind such a demand. I walked inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and placed the letter in front of me. I read every line carefully, trying to make sense of it. They claimed my property had multiple infractions, a boundary violation, an unapproved structure, and even landscaping that supposedly didn't meet their community standards. None of it made sense. I had lived there peacefully for years, taking care of my home, maintaining my lawn, and ensuring everything was neat. Suddenly, they were treating me like I was the greatest offender in the neighborhood. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of injustice pressing on me. I thought about all the times I had seen neighbors receive warnings for minor things like leaving trash cans out a little too long or painting their fence the wrong shade. But this was different. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was an attempt to break me financially, to intimidate me into submission. It was as though they wanted to remind me that they held power over every inch of the neighborhood, including my own home. I stared out the window for a while, watching the quiet street, the trees swaying gently, and children riding their bicycles freely. Everything looked so peaceful outside, but inside, I felt like a storm had just entered my life. I kept asking myself, what had I done to deserve this? Why had they targeted me so aggressively? No answer came, only silence and the heavy presence of that letter on the table. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the thought of how this could change everything. $150,000 wasn't just an unreasonable fine, it was life-changing money. People worked years, even decades, to save that amount, and here was the HOA, acting as if they could just write a piece of paper and demand it from me without justification. It didn't feel real, but the letter was proof enough that they meant business. I imagined what it would be like if I gave in, if I somehow borrowed the money or sold assets just to pay them off. The very thought of surrendering to such an unfair demand made my stomach turn. It wasn't only about the money, it was about my dignity, my rights, and the principle of living freely on my own land. Paying them would mean admitting guilt for something I had not done, and I couldn't allow myself to bend to that kind of pressure. The strangest part was how official the letter looked. They had formatted it with legal language, stamped it with their insignia, and signed it with authority. Anyone who didn't know better might believe it was the law itself speaking through those words, but I knew the difference. I knew that beneath all the official formatting, this was simply a group of people trying to flex power they didn't fully own. Still, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend the letter didn't exist. If I did nothing, they might escalate it further. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the situation in my mind, reading the letter again and again under the dim kitchen light. I thought about every possible outcome. Would they try to place a lien on my property? Would they try to take me to court? The possibilities spun around in my head like a storm. And yet, even in my worry, a part of me felt something stronger. A spark of defiance. Deep down, I knew there was no way this was right. There was no way they had the authority to demand such an amount for trivial reasons. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, and I decided that I couldn't simply accept it. I began making a plan. The first step was to gather everything I had: property deeds, land surveys, every official record related to my home. If they were going to claim violations, I wanted to see exactly what legal ground they thought they were standing on. The second step was to review their rules, every line of their guidelines. I wanted to see if there was anything, no matter how small, that could justify what they were trying to do. And finally, I promised myself that if I found even the slightest inconsistency, I would challenge them. As I sat there with papers scattered across the table, I realized this wasn't just about me. If they could target me with such an absurd fine, they could do the same to anyone else in the neighborhood. Perhaps they already had. Perhaps other homeowners had felt the same fear, but instead of fighting, they gave in. I didn't want to be one of those people. I wanted to push back, not just for myself, but for the principle that no one should be bullied in their own home. The next morning, I looked at the letter one last time and felt a calm determination settle over me. The HOA might think they had the upper hand, but I wasn't about to let them dictate my life. That $150,000 fine might have been their way of trying to scare me, but it had the opposite effect. It lit a fire inside me, one that pushed me to look deeper into what was really happening in this neighborhood. Little did I know at that moment, the letter wasn't just a fine. It was the beginning of a discovery that would change everything, not only for me, but for the entire community. When the notice from the HOA landed in my hands, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. The letter was worded in the kind of official tone that is designed to intimidate, filled with legal language, rules, and bold numbers. At the top, highlighted in dark ink, was the fine amount: $150,000. I read it once, then again, thinking my eyes were deceiving me. How could this be? I had always taken care of my home and my property with precision and responsibility. Every upgrade, every repair, every small change I had made was either within the boundaries of what was allowed or fully permitted. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could justify such a staggering amount. As I stood there in my living room, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, a mix of disbelief and anger began to rise. Confusion wrapped around me like a heavy fog. I tried to remember if there had ever been a warning, an email, or even a casual conversation that suggested I might be in violation of the rules. Nothing came to mind. I had never ignored notices, never left issues unresolved, never given the HOA reason to pursue me. Yet here it was, a demand so outrageous it could upend anyone's life. The first emotion I felt was pure bewilderment. How could a neighborhood association, whose role was supposed to be about maintaining community standards, suddenly throw such a crushing fine at me? I reread the sections outlining supposed violations. They mentioned improper land use and unauthorized modifications, vague phrases that seemed intentionally broad. But when I looked around my property, I saw only a well-kept yard, a secure home, and small improvements that any responsible homeowner would make. Nothing was out of place. Nothing screamed a violation. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. I imagined the HOA board members sitting in their meeting room, flipping through paperwork and deciding without hesitation that I should be punished. Did they even check the facts? Did they visit my property, or did they simply want to flex their authority? The idea that they could wield this much power over my life seemed deeply unfair. I sat down at my desk and spread the papers in front of me, hoping that by examining every line, I would find some sort of explanation. Instead, all I found were contradictions. On one page, they claimed my property lines extended into a restricted zone. On another, they suggested I had built without permission. But the documents in my own files showed otherwise. I had approval for every change I had made. I had permits signed, receipts filed, and correspondence saved. My frustration grew with every contradiction I uncovered because it seemed the fine wasn't rooted in truth at all. Despite the rising tide of anger, I couldn't shake the confusion. I had always believed that organizations like HOA were there to support homeowners, not to crush them. The community had always been marketed as a peaceful and cooperative place, one where neighbors looked out for one another. Yet the notice I held painted a very different picture, one where authority was used not to protect but to intimidate. I found myself pacing through the house, muttering questions aloud. Why me? Why now? What do they gain from this? My mind kept circling back to the same thought. This wasn't about violations. It was about control. But still, I couldn't understand why the target had to be me. I wasn't a troublemaker. I wasn't behind on dues, and I certainly wasn't reckless with my property. Late into the night, I tried to calm myself by stepping outside into the cool air. The neighborhood looked peaceful under the street lights. The homes stood quietly, manicured lawns glowing faintly in the dark, driveways empty after a long day. Nothing about the scene suggested the kind of battle the HOA was trying to drag me into. Yet, behind that calm surface, I knew there was an invisible weight pressing down on me, demanding answers to questions that had no clarity. The frustration didn't just come from the fine itself, but from the realization of how powerless I felt in that moment. How do you fight back against an organization that seems to have the rules on its side? How do you defend yourself when the accusations are vague enough to mean anything they want them to mean? I kept replaying the scenarios in my head, writing letters, attending meetings, arguing my case, but each one ended with me being dismissed or ignored. As the days passed, the confusion only deepened. Neighbors began to whisper, some asking quietly if I had done something wrong, others speculating about what the fine was for. Their words, though not cruel, carried weight. I felt singled out, marked by the very people I had lived alongside peacefully for years. There were emails with the HOA itself confirming that certain changes had been accepted without issue. Piece by piece, I was building a fortress of evidence. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough if I didn't have the courage to use it. That was where the real test lay. Standing my ground meant confronting the HOA directly, knowing they wouldn't back down easily. I reminded myself that the fine was not just about money. It was about control. If I surrendered, they would see me as weak, and that would only encourage them to continue. If I stood firm, they would realize I wasn't someone to be pushed around. It wasn't easy. Doubt crept in constantly. Late at night, when the house was silent, I would imagine worst-case scenarios. What if they placed a lien on my home? What if they dragged me into a long legal battle? What if neighbors turned against me, believing the AASO version of events instead of the truth? These thoughts haunted me, but each time I came back to the same conclusion. If I didn't fight, I had already lost. The only way forward was through. I decided to write a response to their notice. Not a rushed emotional letter, but a carefully written reply backed with facts. I wanted them to see immediately that I wasn't intimidated, that I had evidence, and that I wasn't afraid to use it. I drafted the letter slowly, choosing every word with precision. I pointed out that the so-called violations they listed had already been approved, that their claims contradicted existing records, and that the amount they demanded was unjustified. I attached copies of deeds, permits, and correspondence as proof. By the time I finished, I had created a response that was calm but firm, respectful but unshakable. Sending that letter was like drawing a line in the sand. I knew they wouldn't like it, but I didn't care. I wasn't trying to win their approval. I was standing for the truth. I was making it clear that I wouldn't be bullied no matter how many official stamps or bold numbers they put on their letters. Once the letter was sent, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt since opening the notice. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I had taken the first real step. Instead of sitting in confusion, I was moving forward with purpose. Instead of feeling helpless, I was asserting my rights. Of course, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to fold after a single response. They might escalate things, send lawyers, or try new tactics to pressure me. But I had already accepted that reality. Standing my ground meant being ready for the storm. And now that I had committed, I felt stronger than before. I also began to think about the bigger picture. If they had tried this with me, how many others had they pressured in the same way? How many homeowners had quietly paid fines, not because they were guilty, but because they were afraid of standing up to the HOA? The thought angered me, but it also motivated me. If I pushed back, I wouldn't just be protecting myself. I might be showing others that they too could resist unfair treatment. In the days that followed, I carried myself differently. I no longer avoided neighbors or kept quiet when people looked at me curiously. I walked with confidence, knowing I had nothing to hide. If anyone asked about the fine, I simply said I was handling it. I didn't need to explain myself to gossip or speculation. What mattered was that I knew the truth, and I was prepared to defend it. There were still moments when fear crept in. That was natural. No one wants to face the possibility of conflict with an organization that seems to hold power over your home. But each time the fear rose, I reminded myself of the evidence in my possession. Fear can only survive in uncertainty, and I had certainty on my side. Standing my ground became more than just a decision. It became a mindset. I refused to let them control my thoughts, my peace, or my life. The HOA might have authority in the community, but they did not have authority over what was right and wrong. They did not have authority over me. Looking back, I realized that the letter they sent was meant to weaken me, but in an unexpected way, it strengthened me instead. It forced me to dig deep, to discover a resolve I didn't know I had. I wasn't just defending my property. I was defending my dignity, my rights, and my freedom to live without fear in my own home. The battle was only beginning, but I was ready. Whatever came next, I would meet it with calm strength. I would not run, I would not pay what I didn't owe, and I would not let them intimidate me into silence. I had chosen my path, and there was no turning back. When the letters and warnings piled up on my desk, I realized that ignoring the HOA would not solve anything. The fine they had issued was not just a number on paper. It was a direct challenge to my ownership and peace of mind. That is when I decided to stop reacting emotionally and start acting strategically. Instead of letting their letters frustrate me, I gathered every document I had related to my property. Old files that I had not touched in years suddenly became valuable. Deeds, maps, receipts, and even tax records were pulled out of drawers and folders. I knew that somewhere in the paperwork, the truth about the land and my rights would reveal itself. At first, the process felt overwhelming. The legal language in many of the documents was not easy to understand. Each page seemed packed with terms that required patience and focus. I spent hours at my dining table, highlighting sections and taking notes. The deeper I went, the more I realized that property ownership was far more complicated than a simple boundary line drawn on a map. There were easements, rights of way, and special clauses that defined what one could or could not do with a piece of land. Still, I pressed on, determined to uncover anything that could help me stand against the HOA unfair demand. Some nights I sat with a cup of coffee and read through old survey reports. These reports showed measurements, landmarks, and the positioning of structures long before the neighborhood took shape. I noticed details that seemed unusual, streets and cul-de-sacs that were listed under parcels not owned by the HOA, but by an individual me. At first, I thought it must have been a clerical mistake. Could it be that the HOA had been managing land they did not actually own? I decided to cross-check these findings at the county records office. Walking into the building, I felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement. I asked the clerk for access to the property archives and was guided to a section filled with thick books and digital records. It was like stepping back in time, seeing documents that recorded decades of land deals, transactions, and developments. I searched for the name of the original developer who had built the neighborhood. Page after page revealed the history of how the land was divided, sold, and repurposed. Then I came across an entry that made me pause. The developer had never fully purchased one large section of land. It was still tied to the title I owned. To be sure, I ordered official copies of the records. With the stamped papers in my hands, the weight of the discovery began to sink in. It was no longer a suspicion. It was fact. The HOA was not only wrong about their authority over my property, but they were also sitting on land they had no rightful claim to manage. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the records office, staring at the documents. A feeling of vindication washed over me, mixed with a sense of responsibility. If what I had found was true, then I was not just defending myself from a fine. I was uncovering a much larger issue that affected every person living in that neighborhood. Over the next few days, I carefully organized all my findings. I created folders with labels, marked key passages with sticky notes, and even drew diagrams to make the boundaries easier to understand. The more I worked, the stronger my case became. I realized that the HOA had likely never expected anyone to challenge them at this level. They had built their power on the assumption that homeowners would simply pay up rather than investigate. But I was not willing to be intimidated. Each document I uncovered was like a shield, giving me the courage to stand taller. There were moments when I questioned myself. What if I had misunderstood the documents? What if the HOA had more resources and could twist the facts in their favor? But every time doubt crept in, I went back to the evidence. The deeds were clear, the maps aligned, the signatures were there in black and white. This was not an interpretation. It was truth backed by law. That realization gave me the confidence to move forward. In quiet moments, I thought about how ironic it was. They had tried to bury me under the weight of a fine, but in doing so, they had pushed me into the very records that revealed the truth. Their attempt to weaken me had, in fact, strengthened my position. It felt almost poetic, as though the land itself was speaking through these documents, reminding me of the rights I had all along. As I looked through the final folder one evening, I realized I had everything I needed to turn the situation around. Bro, I was no longer just a homeowner being fined unfairly. I was someone holding undeniable proof of ownership with the power to change the story completely. What had started as an act of defense had now become a discovery that could shift the balance of authority in the entire neighborhood. And with that realization, I knew the next step would be to reveal the truth to those who had tried so hard to silence me. The evening after organizing all the records, I sat quietly in my study, staring at the papers that lay spread out across the desk. The evidence was right there, waiting to be acknowledged for what it truly meant. For days, I had been piecing together fragments, thinking it was just a matter of proving that the HOA had no right to fine me. But as I connected the final dots, the truth became clear, and it was far more astonishing than anything I had expected. This wasn't just about my house or my yard. This was about the land beneath the entire neighborhood. The HOA had been operating with authority over property that didn't even belong to them. It belonged to me. The realization came slowly at first, almost too big for my mind to fully grasp. I reread the official copies from the records office, checking the parcel numbers, the signatures, the dates. The legal descriptions matched exactly with the land under the roads, the parks, and even the spaces the HOA claimed to maintain. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding as the magnitude of it sank in. For years, they had sent letters, enforced rules, and collected fees from every homeowner in the area, yet all of it was built on land that they didn't truly own. The power they claimed to have was an illusion, a structure that only stood because no one had bothered to check. At first, I almost laughed at the irony. Here they were, threatening me with a fine of $150,000, yet the truth was that their entire authority was standing on my property. It was like someone trying to evict me from my own living room, not realizing that the house was mine all along. But the laughter quickly faded, replaced by a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about understanding what this meant for every family living in the neighborhood. I began imagining the implications. The streets, the sidewalks, the common spaces, they no longer felt like areas ruled by someone else. They felt like pieces of a story that had always been mine, a story that I was now ready to tell. The HOA had issued their fine with the belief they held all the power. But the real power came from truth, and the truth was finally on my side. The folder containing all my discoveries sat on the table like a weapon no one had expected me to carry. Every time I glanced at it, I felt a renewed strength, because within those pages was the truth that changed everything. The HOA had approached me with demands, threats, and arrogance, but now I was the one holding the real power. For weeks, they had acted as if I were just a stubborn homeowner standing against an unbeatable system. What they didn't know was that I now had the evidence to reverse the situation entirely. The decision to confront them was not one I took lightly. I thought about all the meetings they had called, the way they spoke down to homeowners, the letters they sent in bold, intimidating language. They had operated as if no one could question them. But as I prepared my next move, I realized I had the rare opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that could not be ignored. I imagined the scene in my mind, their confident faces turning pale as they saw the stamped documents, their voices stumbling as they realized their entire authority had no legal ground. The very people they had tried to intimidate would watch the tables turn right in front of them. In the days leading up to the meeting, I rehearsed what I would say. It wasn't about anger anymore. I had felt all of that before, but now I carried something greater, calm certainty. My goal wasn't to shout or prove I was stronger. My goal was to let the truth speak for itself. Still, I knew it would take courage to stand before the same group that had once held power over me and reveal to them that their authority was nothing more than smoke. The evening of the meeting arrived, and I walked into the community hall with my folder in hand. The board members were already seated at the front, their usual expressions of superiority painted across their faces. Other homeowners filled the seats, some looking frustrated, some tired, and some simply resigned to the idea that this was just another meeting where nothing good would come for them. I took a seat near the front, my documents tucked safely under my arm. My heart raced, but I reminded myself that I was not walking into a battle I could lose. I was walking into a moment that had already been decided by truth. The meeting began as it always did, with the board speaking in firm tones, reading out violations, and addressing homeowners as if they were children needing correction. I listened quietly, waiting for my moment. Finally, the subject of my fine came up. One of the members leaned forward and began to describe my so-called violations again, repeating the same baseless claims they had written in the notice. Their voices carried the same authority they always had, but this time I felt no fear. When they finished, I stood up. Calmly, I placed the folder on the table in front of them and said I had something important to share. The room grew quiet as I opened the folder and began laying out the documents, one by one. I explained how I had traced the ownership records, how I had confirmed the parcels at the county office, and how the land under their very feet was legally mine. At first, they tried to brush it off, their voices sharp, accusing me of misunderstanding, but I did not argue. Instead, I let the official stamps and signatures do the speaking. I pointed out the parcel numbers, the maps, the deeds, all of it aligning perfectly to show that their authority was built on land they didn't own. The board's confidence began to crack. Their eyes darted to one another, their voices faltered. Some of the homeowners leaned forward, eager to see the papers, whispering among themselves as the truth began to spread through the room. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive. They asked questions, but their words sounded weaker now, more like attempts to hold on to something slipping through their fingers. I answered each calmly, never raising my voice, never showing anger, just steady, unshakable certainty. As the weight of my discovery settled over the room, I could feel the balance of power shifting. The homeowners who had come expecting another night of rules and fines were now witnessing a revelation. Their faces showed disbelief, then hope as they realized that the board's authority was not absolute. It was a performance that had only lasted this long because no one had looked closely enough at the foundation, and now that foundation had been exposed. By the time I finished presenting the documents, the silence in the room was heavy. The board, once so commanding, now sat quietly, avoiding eye contact. The homeowners began asking questions, not to me, but to them. How could they fine people when the land wasn't theirs? How could they claim power they didn't rightfully hold? The questions grew louder, sharper, and the board had no answers. I stood there watching as the tables truly turned. The very people who had stood against me now had to answer to the community. I didn't need to gloat or celebrate. The truth itself had done the work. I simply reminded them that their $150,000 fine was invalid because they had no authority over my property, or anyone else's for that matter. What had once been their strongest weapon was now nothing more than a meaningless piece of paper. Walking out of that meeting, I felt lighter than I had in months. The air was fresh, the sky clear, and for the first time since the conflict began, I felt completely free. I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. The board might try to resist, might try to find loopholes, but the truth could not be undone. I had shown them, and the entire community, that the power they claimed was never theirs to begin with. Turning the tables wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance. It was about proving that no one should live under fear when the facts say otherwise. And as I walked back to my home, I realized that what had started as a fight for myself had become something much larger. It had become a reminder that truth, once revealed, can topple even the strongest seeming authority